Edward Bawden was born in 1903 in Braintree, Essex, and his youthful enthusiasm and talent for drawing led him to study 1 day a week at Cambridge School of Art from the age of 15. When he left school, he immediately went full-time at the art school between 1919 and 1921. And in 1922, he received a scholarship for the Royal College of Art in London and left there in 1925. But even before he had graduated from the RCA, he had collaborated with fellow illustrator Thomas Derrick on this incredibly complex poster for that year's British Empire exhibition. By the mid-1920s, he was creating wallpaper designs as well as limited edition prints and watercolours, which were also attracting favourable attention. More poster commissions followed, several of which were created for London Transport, and for quite a few years he was a popular choice with this client. In 1928, he was also tasked with designing a series of tiled wall decorations in London Underground stations for that year's Building Trades exhibition at Olympia. And in the same year, his first book illustrations were published in The Life and Adventures of Peter Wilkins, originally written in the 1700s by Robert Paltok. But despite the historical setting of the tale, the line and pochoir printed images Bawden created for this project were particularly modernist and distinctive. He was also commissioned, along with fellow Royal College graduates Eric Revilius and Charles Mahoney, to create a series of murals for the refectory at Morley College in London. This project was completed in 1930, but unfortunately the building was destroyed during the Blitz a decade later, and all we have are some of the original designs on paper and a few black and white photos. It was also in 1930 that he took on a part-time teaching post at the Royal College of Art, and his second illustrated book, Adam and Evelyn at Kew by Robert Herring, was also published. This frivolous piece of fiction inspired a series of particularly engaging, fanciful pen and wash full-colour page illustrations from Bawden. By this time he was also working 1 day a week at the printing and publishing company Kirwan Press, and in this capacity he created illustrations for a range of prestigious clients, including Shell Oil. And for them he designed this rather bleak but compelling poster and a series of far more whimsical monochrome pen and ink press ads, all of which featured great use of empty space, quite unlike what was being produced in the world of advertising at the time. In 1932 he married Charlotte Epton, who he had known since college days, and they had 2 children, both of whom would later become artists. They subsequently moved from their flat in Hammersmith to a Georgian house in the village of Great Bardfield in Essex, where Bawden was inspired to create many watercolour landscapes. But it was commercial print work which dominated his output, and in the early 1930s he added London's elite department store Fortnum & Mason to his list of clients, while continuing to produce more posters for London Transport using a variety of styles and techniques, both formal and more gestural. In 1938 he illustrated his first children's picture book, Lady Filmy Fern, an outlandish comic fantasy about a giant spider written by Thomas Hennell. For this commission, Bawden created a series of suitably peculiar and imaginative pen and wash illustrations, which greatly enhanced the book's appeal. And they were, like so much of his other work, considerably ahead of what most others were creating at the time. In that year he collaborated with his neighbour John Aldridge on a range of wallpapers that they intended to have printed from their hand-cut lino blocks. But before they could begin production, Britain declared war on Germany and the project was abandoned. In 1940, a series of recipe books by Ambrose Heath promoting healthy eating on a wartime budget was published, each with a cover design by Bawden. But by the time they were published, he'd already been posted to North Africa and the Middle East as an official War Office artist. After a year or so, he was recalled to London, but the ship was sunk by a German torpedo, and following 5 days at sea in an open lifeboat, he was rescued, only to be held prisoner in an internment camp in Casablanca, before the camp was liberated by American troops a few months later. He returned to Iraq in 1943 and several of the Middle Eastern and European countries, recording what he saw up to the end of the war in 1945. Once back home, Bawden returned to freelance work, and in 1946 he illustrated a book of verse on the theme of travel, compiled by M.G. Lloyd Thomas. All the images he produced for this book were created as distinctively coloured traditional lithographs, and in creative terms, if perhaps not so much financially, this was a triumphant and visually absorbing return to his illustration career. Travel seems to have dominated his subject matter at this time, and he also created several light-hearted monochromes to accompany a magazine series about various global destinations. He resumed his teaching post at the Royal College at this time and was in great demand for the design and illustration of book covers. And in this context he proved to be just as imaginative and aesthetically considered as with the rest of his output. And in 1947 he designed a poster for the film Hue and Cry, which confirmed that Bawden had little time for what others in the same genre were creating. He didn't ignore his art career either, and increasingly began producing lino cuts. This spectacular run of productivity continued with 1947's book World Off Duty, which contained a collection of engrossing colour images of people at play and in leisure pursuits, presumably as a recognition of the exuberance and optimism felt following the years of war. And in a similar vein, he created some agreeable watercolour crowd scenes of British life for the magazine Lilliput in 1948. In 1949, the book London is London, a selection of prose and verse by D.M. Lowe was published. And as well as the cover, Bawden was commissioned to create monochrome line drawings of the various locations mentioned in the text. But most significantly, in the same year, his collection of colour lithographs, collectively titled Life in an English Village, was also published by Penguin Books. And this was arguably his greatest achievement to date. In the post-war years of austerity and rationing in Britain, the countryside and its quaint, unpolluted villages took on considerable iconic importance, and consequently Bawden's evocations of the mundane but agreeable world he lived in struck a significant and enduring chord. And in 1951 he was invited to create a mural titled English Country Life, which was on display at that year's Festival of Britain. Although the war had temporarily ended his association with Fortnum and Mason, in the early 50s he resumed work for them and was extremely prolific in the amount and quality of graphic promotional material he produced. During the war, Bawden had amused himself creating illustrated stories for his children, and the first of these, Take the Broom, was printed as a lithographic limited edition by his friend and academic colleague Sheila Robinson in 1952. In the following year, John Metcalfe's London A to Z was published, with a cover and monochrome page illustrations by Bawden. And his idiosyncratic poster for the comedy film The Titfield Thunderbolt was also to be seen on the walls of British towns and cities. Between 1954 and 1958, the group known as the Great Bardfield Artists, with Bawden their most prominent member, held a series of exhibitions in the village which attracted thousands of viewers, and they had equal success with more exhibitions subsequently held in other locations. In 1957 he illustrated the children's picture book The Arabs, with a series of double pages featuring well-composed large crowd scenes. And in the same year he designed and illustrated a book celebrating the 250th anniversary of Fortnum and Mason, using a keen eye for page layout, limited colour palette, and a large volume of amusing and imaginative line drawings throughout. In 1958 he returned to classic literature and illustrated the book Vathek, written by William Beckford in 1786, using intensely coloured lithography with absorbing and distinctive results. He'd also been busy on a new mural for the rebuilt Morley College, which was unveiled in 1958, and where the original had been Shakespearean in its theme, this celebrated Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. In 1963 he finally published the complete collection of stories he'd written and drawn for his children, almost 20 years earlier, as one volume. Take the Broom was among them, and the whole delightfully absurd collection was published as Hold Fast by Your Teeth. Once more the depth of his occasionally sardonic wit and imagination was revealed in these simple but effective narrative illustrations. Bawden stopped teaching at the Royal College in 1963, but by this time his limited edition prints were particularly sought after by collectors. And among the many predominantly lino-cut landscapes he created, he produced numerous scenes of contemporary London, which were later gathered together and published in book form. In the later 1960s he returned to teaching with part-time posts at the Royal Academy Schools and Leicester School of Art, and in 1969 his visualisation of Gulliver's Travels was published. Once more, Bawden demonstrated with apparent ease what he was capable of in terms of captivating narrative illustration, with just a few imaginatively chosen and applied lithographic colours and expressive fine line work. Although the series had been created over a period of years, 1970 saw the completion of a set of stunning prints based on stories from the fables of Aesop. Each was published as a limited edition, and they were eagerly bought by collectors. These lino cuts, although created as art, had obviously been inspired by his fascination with the visualisation of narrative work, and as such they constituted a remarkable fusion of both disciplines. Sadly, 1970 also saw the death of his wife, and subsequently Bawden moved to the nearby town of Saffron Walden. At this point his output slowed considerably, but in 1975 he published his illustrated edition of Samuel Johnson's 1759 History of Rasselas, with yet another series of decorative and imaginative limited colour lithographs. In later life he concentrated increasingly on making prints, most of which continued to be created as lino cuts. And among other projects in the 80s he used the same process to create a series of suitably medievalist illustrations for Thomas Mallory's 1485 Morte d'Arthur. And following a remarkable life and career of more than 60 years, Edward Bawden didn't stop working up to his eventual death in 1989, aged 86. In my research for this video I found a particularly large amount of remarkable work which could fairly be called an embarrassment of riches, from the many areas of illustration he had worked in. And a lot of this has inevitably ended up on the virtual cutting room floor. But here's a small compilation of some of my personal favourites to end with, which I hope you'll agree are deserving of a place, even if I couldn't manage to shoehorn them into the narrative.